My name is John Goldsmith, and this is the third video that I'm making in a series of videos about autosegmental phonology. And in this video, I'm going to talk about the tonal pattern in Tonga, which is a Bantu language spoken in Zambia. And there's been a lot of work done on this language over quite a number of years. I've mentioned specifically the work of Hazel Carter and of A.E. Mawson, Jim Macaulay, Michael Cohn, who was a grad student at MIT a couple of years after me. I worked on it. There's some work that followed mine, that, for example, that of Doug Pulley-Blank, which I found very provocative. And, well, the discussions continued, and I'll talk a bit about this later on. The question as to whether there's some sense in which Tonga should be viewed as an accentual language, and exactly what that sense is somewhat controversial. Anyway, so let's take a look at it. Throughout this video, I'll be using the notational convention that a high tone vowel is marked with an acute accent and a low tone vowel is not marked with any accent at all. Let's take a look first at the tonal pattern of nouns. We're going to focus on the verbs, but it's good to have some awareness of what the tone patterns are on the nouns, because in a certain sense it's simpler, and it'll serve us in good stead when we turn to look at the nouns. So, when we turn to look at the verbs. So, in nouns, there is one class of nouns in which we get low on all the stem vowels and high on everything that precedes. Okay, so let's just remind ourselves or take a look at the morphology of the noun. So a noun has a stem, which I've put in italics here. It's preceded by a noun class prefix, which is typically of the form CV, and that in turn is preceded by what's sometimes called a pre-prefix by Bantuists, or an augment. I'll call it a pre-prefix. So in the case of ibusi, we've got a pre-prefix and a class prefix I and bu, respectively, followed by the stem C. This means smoke, class 14. So we have ibusi. And for now, just forget about the star that you see there, the asterisk. I'll come back to that later. Just ignore it. Another word that has the same properties is imakani. So I and ma are prefixes. I is the augment or pre-prefix. Ma is a class prefix. And kani is the stem. And we've got low tones on the stem. There's a different tonal class of words that have high followed by low. And once again, all the prefixes are high. So we've got an example like imusune. High on the pre-prefix and on the prefix mu, and on the first syllable of the stem su, and then low on ne. Then the third class of nouns is low throughout. Low on the prefixes, low through the stem. So ibusu is an example of that. All right, let's quickly take a look at infinitives. Infinitives, as in Tonga, as in most Bantu languages, are nouns. They are in a particular tone class. Sorry, they're in a particular noun class, and typically described as class 15. And so we've got words like ukubona. So the K, the letter that's written as a K, is a R, it's a voice feeler fricative. So we've got the infinitive ubona, and bon is the stem to C. Then we've got highs on the prefixes, u and hu, but low on the stem and on the final vowel that follows. And similarly, well, actually differently, in the other tonal class, as far as verbs are concerned, these are verbs that have all low tone throughout. So we have ulanga. So we've got a tonal contrast between between infinitives that are like ugubona and those that are like ulanga. All right, with that under our belts, we can turn to the verbs, which is where the action is. So here is a template of what we expect to see in the present tense. So in the present tense, as you see here, we've got subject markers, and I've only indicated 6. There's lots more. These are personal subject markers, followed by a tense marker, which in the present is la, followed optionally by an object marker, followed then by a radical, bone, for example, to see, and lang, for example, to look at. Bone we already saw in the infinitival form, it was ugubona, and lang we saw as well as ugulanga. And then the final vowel, which in this case is an a. All right? So let's look further at what the tone patterns are that we see here. So let's look at 12 forms. These 12 forms will basically cover all the cases that we're interested in. So we're looking at the present indicative, looking at the top box here, the one with lots of different colors in it. And I've drawn it this way so you can begin to be a little bit comfortable with the morphological analysis of the verb. Okay, so let's just look here. We've got 3 columns having to do, these are verbs with no object marker in the left-hand side. In the middle column, we've got the object marker mu here in this kind of gold. And then on the right, we've got ba. And mu and ba represent the 2 different tonal patterns that are possible for the object marker. And here in the first column, there is no object marker. The first morpheme in all cases is a subject marker. So ndi, that's I, first person singular, and ba, that's the third person plural. And those represent the 2 different tonal possibilities for all the subject markers. Finally, lang, which is in blue, that's our verb root or radical, and I've drawn it here in blue. Lang represents one tonal possibility, bon the other. So these are the cases that we have to look at. All right. Well, let's now look at them from a tonal point of view. I'm going to read through them here. There are very few high tones here, and I'll just point them out when we get to them. So looking at the first case, we have ndila langa, it's all low. Ndila mulanga, all low. Ndila balanga, all low. Second row, balalanga, all low. Balamulanga, all low. And now finally we get our first high tone, balabalanga. Okay, so the la is on a high. Go to the third row, dilabona, all low. Dilamubona, all low. Dilababona, all low. All right. Now we get to the fourth line, a bunch of high tones. Balabona, we have a high on the la. Balamubona, we've got a high on both la and mu. And then finally, balababona. All right, so what is going on here? Well, Melson wrote a beautiful article about it, and so we're all following his point of view in a certain sense. But he had an advantage over the most, let's say, graduate students who are beginning to work on phonology. He knew Bantu tone languages, and he knew which ones of these morphemes were high in Proto-Bantu and in most of the neighboring families. And he knew it, and now I know it, and you probably don't. So let's sort of follow through his logic here, even though he undoubtedly got to the result in a much more direct way. All right, so let's see. Where were those high tones? There was one high tone in row 2, and there were basically 4 of them in row 4, and those were the cases where the subject marker was ba. So something about ba as a subject marker lends itself to there being high tones, although it itself is never high. Second of all, we see that there are more high tones in the fourth line than there are in the second. So it has something having to do with bon lends itself to having high tones as opposed to lang. And finally, we see that the bon object marker also lends itself in some fashion to the presence of a high on the la. Let's see, what is the case that illustrates that most clearly? It's on the second row that we get a high tone on la in between the 2 bas, but not between ba and mu in the second column. All right, so following Madison's logic, we've got something special about the ba subject marker, something special about the ba object marker, something special about the verb's root bon. Well, and he knew all of these were high in neighboring languages like Luganda and the like. So he, in effect, said, or I'll rewrite what he said as, put those morphemes in blue, And now you see down here, I've just made some morphemes blue. Now it has to do with tonal properties, not the blue that I used up above. And what the heck do we see? Well, we see that the high tone morphemes, we see that the morphemes that are high are precisely the morphemes that are not blue, but are surrounded on either side by blue morphemes. So here we have balabalanga and balabona and balandibona and balababona. So there you are. The analysis says some morphemes are blue, and if you're a morpheme that's not blue, but you're surrounded by blue morphemes, then you'll be high. Otherwise, you'll be low. And that's the analysis. Wow. All right, let's think about that a little bit more. Well, the analysis can't be that some morphemes are blue and others are not. And let's turn this into a more concrete proposal by looking at the tone pattern on the infinitives and taking some inspiration from what we see there. Infinitives, like those formed from the root bon, have a high on all the syllables that precede the stem, and then low on bon and what follows. So we've got a high-low melody there. Let's take that as the basis of our hypothesis. For roots like lang, the infinitive is low throughout. We're gonna work from the hypothesis that if a word is assigned no tones at all, that low is a default value. Basically, after all of the other mechanisms have done their work, if a word has no tones, it's assigned a low tone as a default case. All right, well, let's do that then. Let's suppose that there's a high-low melody that's associated with ba, the subject marker, and ba, the object marker, and the verb root bon. And it's the low that's associated to the vowel in each of those morphemes. Let's take a look at what the representations would look like in that case. So these are the representations that we'd have for the 12 words that we've been looking at. So we look at these here, and we can see that the first two on the top row have no tones at all, and therefore they'll get a default low, and they are all low, which is just fine. With the other 10 words, if you recall from just a minute ago, there were only 4 of them that had high tones, and I'll just point out which ones these are. So there's balabalanga and balababona and balamubona and balababona. Okay, all the rest have low tones. So is there anything that these representations can do to shed light on that generalization? So I've added association lines for the morphemes that are high in tone in those 4 cases, and you can see that those are all morphemes that would get a high tone from that unassociated high. The well-formed execution will add that association line, and we can see that in all of the cases where there is a surface high, it's in a case where there were at least 2 high-low packages. In all the other cases that we're looking at, let's say, just take a look at the tula balanga, the rightmost one on the top row. There's a single high-low melody, and it doesn't lead to any highs on the surface. Okay, so how should we put this? What we can see then is that a word initial high, which is just to say the first high in a verb here, is deleted. Once we say that a word initial high is deleted, everything else follows. The only highs that will remain are highs that are not word initial, and they'll associate, and we'll get exactly what we need. So we need to postulate then a rule of verb initial high deletion, and we're set. I trust you all can see then that after we delete that word initial high, the high that's left that associates in the 4 words that have high tones, we see that it associates by the well-formed condition. There's one more thing we need to account for, because there are 2 forms which have an unexplained high tone we predict a high tone, and there's no evidence of it. Fortunately, I'll provide you the explanation of it, but I want to point out that there's a high tone in Tulabona and in Balababona. There are high tones which we would expect to show up given autosegmental theory. And so now we need to look more carefully and more deeply into why that high tone doesn't associate either to the left or to the right. Doesn't associate, and it turns out in the end that it wasn't there at all. Well, it's going to get a little more complicated now, so take that in a sense as a bit of a warning. It's not just complicated, it's complex in a good sense. But in any event, there's more that's going on. So let me actually just give you a specific warning. And still looking at the present tense material there, I said we were going to give you an explanation as to why this high that is being pointed at by these two green arrows, why that doesn't surface. And I said, well, that's because they were never really there. Okay, well, what you should bear in mind, because this will be important in what follows, is over the course of looking at these 12 words, we saw a number of high-low packages, but it's only in these two problematic cases that remain where the lows are associated to successive vowels. So it's ba and bon that have this high-low melody, and that's where there's something special that needs to be said. These are the only two cases where the high-low melody, the package of two high-low melodies, are on successive vowels. We're going to turn to a different tense, the recent past tense, which will shed some light on what we've been looking at up to now. The data becomes more complicated, or maybe a better word is complex, because there's an underlying simplicity, which is very beautiful, but it takes us a while we need to do some digging in order to discover it and to see it. Before I get into that, though, there's two other things I need to say a little bit about. One is downstep. And in African languages, we often talk about a downstepped high. So consider these three representations I've got there. On the left, there's two bas marked with a high tone with an exclamation point between them. That exclamation mark marks downstep. So that would be pronounced ba-ba. You hear the two bas are both high. Neither of them are low, but they're not at the same pitch. The second one is a little bit lower. Ba-ba. The second, you see there, has a high tone associated to two syllables. We get ba-ba, they're both high. And the third is indistinguishable from the point of view of the sound, ba-ba, but it's the first that is different, ba-ba, and all three of them are different from high-low, which would be ba-ba. The downstep in almost every language in Africa where we find downstep is the result of an unassociated low in between the two highs. And that's what we'll find here. The other thing I need to tell you a little bit about is the weak versus the strong form. And in Tonga, as in many Bantu languages, there's a phonological marking that distinguishes the case of focus on a verb and focus on the word that follows the verb. So it would be comparable to, in English, the difference between I drank the coffee and I drank the coffee. Or I drank coffee versus I drank coffee. In Tonga, focus on what follows the verb is marked in two ways. First of all, the verb and what follows forms a single phonological unit, and therefore tones from the following word can spread leftward into the verb. And secondly, the first vowel of the word that follows the verb is associated with the familiar high-low melody. The first vowel that follows the verb is associated with a low, and then there's a preceding high which spreads leftward into the verb. And that's what we see here in my little diagram of the weak form. Let's take a look at the tone on the recent past forms. Now the recent past is formed with a tense marker a. So it's a form V rather than CV. And since subject markers all end with a vowel, this would give us a sequence of vowels. On the surface, we don't get vowels in hiatus in Tonga. And so the vowel on the left is elided. Now, it actually is important. Its presence is important. So instead of just completely eliminating it, I've written it in there, but I put a slash through it. So you know that it doesn't surface, but it's present there. And I think we'll see the role that it plays at a certain point. Okay, so here we go. We've got the first verb here on the first row, left column, is dalanga. And you can see you've got a high tone on lang and the final vowel a, unlike the case of the present tense where everything was low. This suggests, and in fact it's correct, that the a is itself associated with the low tone. The tone on the a final vowel and lang has spread from the right, from the word on the right, and it's spread over a and lang, which themselves are unassociated. So that high spread up to the tense marker a, and couldn't get there. We turn to the second example. We have something quite similar. We have damulanga, and so again, the high from the right spreads first to the final vowel a, then to the root lang, and then to the toneless mu, but it doesn't spread onto the a because the a has its own low tone. In the third example, we see something quite surprising. We have dabalanga, and of course what's surprising is not that the high tone spread to a and lang, which of course it should, but it doesn't spread to the ba. But it does spread to the ba. And we know that the ba, from a structural or systematic point of view, is associated to its low tone and has a high tone to its left, but it's gone. So why is that? The a, however, still has its own low tone, and the high tone from the right doesn't spread up to it. So what is going on? Well, I'll tell you. We can't have two of these morphemes associated with HL in a row. That's going to be the key observation. So this ba here, the object marker, does not behave as if it had a high-low melody, and the high tone coming from the right therefore spreads to it. All right, we'll see a lot more of this in a second. Turning to the second row, the first example, we have the sequence of morphemes ba'alanga, which is pronounced balanga, and here we see that the a tense marker is high. Somehow it's lost the low tone, which it had in row 1, which blocked the spreading of the high tone from the right onto it. And why is that? It's simple. I've already told you what the reason is. It's preceded by a subject marker, ba, that itself has its own high-low melody. You can't have two of those in a row. So we've got two of them in a row. A loses its high-low melody, and therefore the high from the right can spread to the left, first onto the final vowel, then onto the lang, and now onto the tense marker. Go to the next example, bamulanga, same thing is happening. The high tone from the right spreads onto the final vowel, to the lang root, to mu, and onto the tense marker. And the third example in the second row is much the same. Notice we've got ba, subject marker, a, tense marker, and ba, object marker. All three of them, from a structural or systematic point of view, have a high-low melody, but only the first keeps it, the ba. The other two, a and ba, lose it, and the high tone from the right spreads across a, lang, ba, and a from right to left. Well, I'll only point out one other example. It's the very last one, fourth row in the third column. Ba, a, ba, bon. All, from a structural point of view, should have a high-low, but in fact, all but the first have lost it. All right. This is geometrically clear if we draw autosegmental representations. I'm going to show you two. I'm going to show you first one where the high-low melodies are not lost, where they're all placed there, where you'd think they ought to be. And then I'll show you what the structure looks like without them, and then you'll really see what's going on. The point of looking at this is to see that the representations that we get, if we include all of the high-low melodies that were motivated when we looked at the present tense. If we include all of those in our representation, we don't even get close to what we need. What we find, what we just found a minute ago in looking at the different forms, is that the high tone that's spreading to the left from the following word is able to move quite a bit from right to left into the verb, which means that the vowels that it spread onto had no tone, even though morphologically their low tone as part of high low melody was motivated as we looked at the present tense. So we need to do something. And what we need to do is to recognize, as I've already indicated, that when you've got a sequence of two or more morphemes that are associated with a high-low package, all but the one on the left loses that package. So I'm going to show you those representations, and then we're going to have to do some serious talk about what kind of rule is this and how do we express it. Just one more thing. I put the representations down below, which are essentially the same as the ones above, except I've put in it with a broken line the association lines, which would be added given what's up above. And some of the forms, the first and second, are correct. The high from the word on the right spreads leftward through the final vowel into the root lang, and even into the object marker mu. And that all is fine, but in essentially all of the following forms, there's a low tone that's in the way, and it doesn't let that high from the right spread far enough. So that's our challenge at this point. So now, down below, I've put the representations after the effect of a rule that deletes an HL package if it's associated with a syllable immediately after another syllable with an HL package. So this gets rid of strings of HLs that are on successive syllables. And if we look at the first and the second case, they're still correct. They were correct above. On the third case on the first line, ba has lost its HL, and so the high spreads to it, which is fine, which is what we need. On the second row, the high spreads up to and including the tense marker, because the tense marker lost its HL, which is fine. Same in the second case, and same in the third. In the third case, both the ah and the ba have lost their high-low package. On the third row, bone loses its high-low package, and so high spreads through bone, just as it did through lang. In this case, we get a neutralization of the high and low roots, or the two tonal classes of roots. I shouldn't call them high and low. In the second case on the third row, there's something else to be said. Look, we notice that both mu and bone are in a high tone, except that there's a downstep. So what's happened here is that the low associated with bone has lost association, and instead it associates to the high on the right, but the low tone there, which dissociated, still is observable on the surface because it triggers the downstep. In the third form on the third row, everything worked just fine. Turning to the fourth row, the first is just fine. Here in the second example in the fourth row, we have exactly the same thing as what we saw above, that the high from the following word pushes its way in and dissociates the low, but the low is still perceptible. It triggers the observable downstep. And then finally, the last case is just right. So if we get rid of these high-low melodies, in the case where they're on successive morphemes, everything works fine. We have to add another small rule that will associate, push the H from the following word, push it leftward, for the two boxes that I mentioned. Okay, now let's talk about what is this HL thing? What is it, and why did I use the word accent before sotto voce? In the analysis so far, I've considered reasons to think of this melody that goes along with certain of these affixes as a high-low melody. And that's actually something that's controversial. It hasn't sounded controversial in the way I described it so far, but it is. And there are several alternatives to it. So I'd like to look briefly at what those alternatives might be. Let's consider the three autosegmental analyses that I've given here. And then there'll be the fourth, which is essentially accentual, which, as I say, is the one that I think is correct. And it leads to the first autosegmental analysis. So the three tonal analyses are, first of all, the tone melody analysis, which says that each of these morphemes that we've been studying that were historically high in tone synchronically have a high-low melody, and the low of that melody is associated with the vowel of that morpheme. Second hypothesis is that these morphemes have vowels. Each morpheme has a vowel that's associated to a low tone. Third hypothesis, each such morpheme has a vowel that's associated to a high tone. Going back to the first one, the high-low package. The high has the property, it's there because it spreads leftward. It can't spread rightward without crossing association lines, which is not permitted. It does, however, spread to the left, both because it needs to be associated to something and because it typically finds vowels there that themselves are not yet associated with the tone, so all the better. And the association line blocks the spreading of unassociated high. On the right, it blocks it from spreading up to that vowel in particular. So those are the properties, and so bear in mind that there are three phonological objects there. There's a high, there's a low, and there's an association line. All three are important players in this story. Second hypothesis would be these morphemes historically have a high, fine, but synchronically they have a low tone. And then the defender of this position would say, and to the left of every low tone is redundantly a high tone. So we're going to have an early rule that inserts a high tone immediately to the left of the low, which then leaves us with an analysis just like the HL package. The third hypothesis is the one that, in a sense, defends the history and says that the underlying tone of these morphemes that historically had an underlying high tone, the underlying tone is indeed a high tone. That high tone will spread to the left. So we'll have to have some kind of statement that it spreads to the left, not to the right. And then after spreading, we have to insert a low tone to associate to the vowel, which then loses its affiliation to the high tone. So that, in a way, seems like the worst analysis. We have to spread first, then take the tone that has spread, dissociate it from the vowel it came in on, and assign a low tone to that vowel. Okay. I'd like to plead in favor of a fourth analysis, and that's an accentual analysis. So what do I mean by accent? I'm going to spend the next video looking at English intonation. And there, if we look at English, it's quite clear that we've got melody packages, which are 2 or 3 tones long. And one of the tones in that package has to be marked as the tone that associates with the accented vowel in English. And I would like to view Tonga in exactly the same way, that there is an accentual system, and there can indeed there is a rule that deletes some of these accents, which will turn to Mason's rule. There can be rules that delete, and in fact there can be rules that move these accents. After the accentual processes have applied, then each accent that remains is associated with or is provided with the tonal melody of the language. And in Tonga, that tonal melody is high, low, where the low is the vowel that's marked, so to speak, as associating with the accented vowel. So accent here is not a characteristic which would apply or would appear only once in a word, this culminativity, which linguists such as Trubetskoy and Larry Hyman have seen as a central characteristic of accent as such. What I believe accent is a formal mechanism in a language which puts its information on where does a particular intonational pattern associate with regard to the vowels or syllables of the word. So accentual systems are where languages, whereas tonal languages in general are those that use different tonal melodies in order to express lexical or grammatical information. Let's summarize where we are. We looked first at nouns briefly, and we saw evidence that in a large number of cases there's a high-low melody where the low associates to a particular vowel in the stem, and everything that precedes is high, and then everything to the right of that first low is also low. We then looked with some care at the present tense, which is expressed with the tense marker la. There we saw a good deal of evidence for the presence of a high-low melody where the low was associated with a vowel of particular morphemes. To put it another way, we saw that morphemes divide into two tonal groups. One seems to be passive in a sense. It has no tonal properties, except it receives tonal specification by virtue of the context in which it's found. The other morphemes, the more interesting ones, have a high-low melody as part of them, and the low is associated with the vowel in that morpheme. The high is unassociated, and it's assigned associations through the well-formative condition to preceding vowels that are themselves not associated. And furthermore, we saw that in the present tense there was a rule of initial high deletion. And in fact, we couldn't tell whether the high that deleted also spread before it underwent deletion. There's no notion of derivational order necessary. Then when we turn to the recent past, we saw evidence for a process which has been called Merson's rule over the last 35 years. In order to talk about that, we have to make some kind of a decision as to how we really think the high-low package should be analyzed. I just mentioned that there were 4 ways to do it. I'm going to use the way that I think is correct, which is to say that at a deep level, some morphemes are accented, some are not. Those that are accented undergo a rule of Merson's rule, which says that in a sequence of adjacent accented morphemes, all but the leftmost one become deaccented. After that, each accented morpheme is assigned a high-low melody. In the high-low melody, the low itself is accented, and it undergoes the association process that I've indicated there with that rule with a dotted line. So that's the essence of what we've seen so far. Let's think a little bit more about association lines and draw this discussion to a close. I'm going to conclude this video with a few general comments about phonology and phonological theory and how it relates to autosegmental phonology. Phonology as we understand it today began in the second half of the 19th century, and we can certainly point to William Dwight Whitney and Baudouin de Courtenay as important figures in the beginning of phonological theory as we know it. And there was a strong sense that one of the goals of the phonologist, or the linguist more generally, was to discover something like atoms. Now, atoms were not widely believed in by scientists in the middle of the 19th century. There was still a great deal of controversy about the existence of atoms in the real world of physics and chemistry. And it wasn't really until the first decade of the 20th century that everybody became convinced that there were indeed such things as atoms. But in linguistics and in the study of sound systems, it was becoming clear to people by the 1870s that there were these units that were critical to understanding how the sound system of a language works. And the term phoneme was adopted. Right from the beginning, you can see this very clearly in William Dwight Whitney's writings. There was an understanding that that phonemes organized themselves in rows and in columns in ways that certainly were not completely unlike the periodic table. And for more discussion about this relationship between the search for atoms and the search for phonemes, do take a look at Battle in the Minefields, a book that I wrote, published last year with Bill Alex. So even in Whitney and in Baudouin de Courtenay, there's a strong sense that phonemes have properties. This became developed in a more sophisticated way under the influence of Edmund Husserl's philosophy in the first decade of the 20th century. That work of Husserl's in that decade had an impact on Drubetskoy and Jakobson, who developed in the 1930s ideas about distinctive features and other relations among phonemes that are still important today. Autosegmental phonology clearly is continuing this conversation and breaking up things that seemed atomic before, and still maintaining the idea that there are atomic things, but there can be sequences of them that are parallel and therefore cotemporal. There's also something really important about the role that association lines play here. They aren't substantive in the way that the segments on different tiers are, and yet they play an important role in the formalism. And I've used this example from Tonga to try to show how much of the hard work, so to speak, in accounting for where the high tones are and the low tones are, much of the analytic work is expended so that the principle of that assigns the association lines is very, very simple. And it's just looking for a set of associations which satisfies very simple geometrical pattern. There's an expression that was used in the 1980s. I don't know who said it first. It might have been Jonathan Kay. It might have been Nick Clements. I'm not sure. It was, get the representations right and the rules will take care of themselves. And that certainly feels right for a lot of the work that has been done using autosegmental phonology. Another way to put that, though, is autosegmental phonology is, I think, we should interpret it as part of a movement towards creating a theory of phonological representations in which the rules are integrated into the representations themselves, so that the representations are, in a certain sense, dynamic, and the rules as we understand them, whether they're language particular or not, are not fundamentally separate from the representations. All right, let's bring this video to a close. The next video will be about English intonation and the importance, the role of the asterisk, and so of course it's going to it's going to play a role in interpreting what we talked about in this video as well, about the use of the accent in presenting an accentual account of Tonga tone.